After the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the Western-aligned countries enacted financial and military assistance aid to Ukraine. These same countries took steps to financially punish Russia with the intent to force it to seek an end to the war. This would be accomplished by creating conditions for regime change in Russia, or at the very least create so much financial pain to the Russian oligarchs that they co-opt the current leadership and force an end to the war. This was the preferred outcome by most Western leaders. The war is in its third year, and the largest land war in Europe since World War II continues with no real end in sight, and Putin was recently inaugurated for another presidential term. This month, a new round of policies is being debated or implemented as both sides attempt to change their fortunes and create a favorable position in the war. The expected Russian spring offensive appears to be underway as the Russians are estimated to have 500,000 men in Ukraine. Last week, the Russian army launched an assault toward Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, and was able to make progress toward the city. The assault was stopped when the Ukrainians committed reserves to the area. It does not appear that the seizing of Kharkiv is the objective, since the Russian committed a relatively small force to the operation when compared to their total strength. The concern is that the Russians will attack in multiple parts of the front through the spring and force the Ukrainians, with their limited manpower, to commit its reserves. This Russian strategy leverages its strength and coincides with the manpower shortage issue that the Ukrainians are experiencing. The Ukrainian government had delayed a decision on new laws that were intended to allow the drafting of more people into the military. The law just passed last week and will allow the Ukrainians to proceed with their draft for more soldiers, but the long delay means that these soldiers will not be trained and armed until late into the summer if they are to be properly trained. This places the Ukrainians, which already have significant manpower issues, under extreme pressure as the Russia campaign is starting. Western aid that had been delayed is starting to arrive, but cannot sufficiently make up for the deficit of soldiers. This means the Russian strategy, even if not as intended to create a breakthrough, has the potential to weaken broad parts of the front, and Ukraine will most likely be forced to deploy their reserves or give up territory to shorten their defensive lines. Russian Deputy Foreign Affairs Minister Sergei Ryabkov, in an interview with TASS last week, stated that the United States had long been in an indirect war with Russia and had played with Ukraine in such a way that it allowed the situation to get out of control, and that created the conditions that led to the Ukraine invasion. Ryabkov's accusation is that the U.S. policy to interfere with the internal politics of Ukraine and the threat of NATO expansion to include Ukraine had created a condition that Russia had to act. The U.S. had allowed its policy to get out of control as it sought its geopolitical goal of regime change in Russia. This is not really a new position, except with the accusation of an indirect war by the U.S. being the centerpiece of the accusation and lays the blame of the war squarely on the U.S. Rybakov also stated that the U.S. has put itself in a position that is ignoring the risks of escalating the war and continues to push for ever greater support to Ukraine. He indicates that the U.S. is in a position that it can only push for the war to end on its terms and does not have a roadmap to end the war outside of escalation. Rybakov added that the decisions being made by the U.S. and its allies had adopted a policy of strategic ambiguity and uncertainty towards Russia, and it makes it difficult for Russia to react to NATO, including the use of nuclear weapons. He stated that Russia will stop creating red lines for NATO and the U.S. not to cross, but will mirror the behavior of the U.S. and its allies. This last statement by Rybakov is a reference of the push by the U.S., the United Kingdom and France to remove all restrictions on the use and type of weapons provided to Ukraine. Early in the war, the initial weapons were defensive in nature, but as time went by, that changed to providing offensive-style weapons. However, all had the stipulation that Ukraine were not to use these weapons to attack the Russian homeland. Any attack of Russia by Ukraine had to be executed using non-Western weapons. That stipulation appears at an end as France's President Emmanuel Macron, UK Foreign Minister David Cameron, and US Secretary of State Antony Blinken have all indicated that they support the use of Western weapons can be used however Ukraine decides to use them. The statement of Rybakov of mirroring US and NATO allies is most likely a reference to this decision by the West. This statement by Mr. Rybakov is just as ambiguous on what a mirrored response to this Western decision would be. The US and its G7 allies are also discussing the seizure of Russian financial assets to support the war in Ukraine. When the war started, the G7 countries decided to freeze Russian financial assets that were deposited in their countries. These assets have a value of $300 billion. The G7 is holding their 50th summit in Italy in June, and the issue seizing the Russian assets will be discussed. The U.S. position is that all these frozen assets should be seized and used to fund the Ukraine war. The European Union position is that seizing of the assets would be illegal since the assets are considered belonging to private parties. The EU is open to the position of using the proceeds of interest and dividends to support the war in Ukraine while leaving the assets intact. This is a significant decision but will most likely not have any impact on the Russian war effort and would be a punitive measure against Putin's allies within Russia. It would also allow the distribution of funds without unanimous consent in the EU or congressional approval in the US. Rybakov stated that the US being in a box and committed to the war with no real war aim outside of the destruction of Russia, according to him and his president Vladimir Putin. Asset forfeiture would allow the U.S. to continue support for the war without any policy debates or justification for its decisions, as forfeited funds will not have congressional oversight. The U.S. and the EU could continue supporting the war as they have through 2025. 2024 is largely funded in the same way they have been since 2022, with no stated achievable stated war aims outside of regime change. The idea of seizing Russian assets for the war is short-sighted and is most likely against U.S. law, just as it is in the EU. Seizing of the assets would also discourage private foreign investment if assets can be seized without regard of assurances given by U.S. law and due process. This is especially true as the U.S. is not at war with Russia. Asset forfeiture is likely illegal, and if Russian assets are seized, foreign investment in the U.S. would suffer both in quantity and faith in American rule of law. The seizing of the profits made from the base assets is in a gray area and can most likely be justified by law but could also impact foreign investment. It is likely the G7 will not agree on forfeiture, but assets gained by the forfeiture are yet to be determined. Rybakov's interview with TASS is informative, but should also be viewed with a healthy dose of skepticism. The idea of an indirect war at first glance seems to be a novel view in how the U.S. is involving itself in the war. It can be better described as a proxy war, just as it did in Afghanistan during Soviet occupation, and just as the Soviet Union did against the U.S. in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. There is nothing novel in what is going on in Ukraine that was not experienced in the Cold War with its bloc politics and proxy wars. The Russians also interfered in Ukraine internal politics, just as the U.S., and it was ultimately the Russians' decision to invade Ukraine in both 2014 and 2022. Rybakov, however, is correct in the Russian difficulty in trying to determine the intent of the U.S. due to the loss of dialogue and diplomatic contact between the U.S. and Russia starting in 2017. Major General Vadim Skibitsky, the deputy chief of Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate, stated that 2024 would be a year that both sides of the conflict would be attempting to get the most favorable battlefield position prior to any serious peace talks happening. As the Russian spring and summer offensive unfold and Western aid starts arriving, it will be a wait-and-see of which side gets the upper hand on the battlefield that, in Skibitsky's point of view, will determine how a final negotiated settlement will look like for Ukraine. Rybakov's statement to TASS, though it has enough truth in it to make it believable, just seems to be more Russian redlines. But the open issue is how willing is the U.S. and the West to push the Russian red lines, or will they wait and see what develops in Ukraine during the campaign season to determine its next step?